Chapter 29. Madness swallowed her in one huge gulp. The mist surrounded her, suffocating and clenching around her spirit form. She should not feel it, since she had no physical form. But this was not a physical place. This was a wild, dangerous mind. She flew toward the bottom, searching for a sign of... Something writhed. Not one thing, many things. Sleek bodies coiled in constant motion. The fog lifted just as she got close enough to see... Snakes covered the ground. Slithering, lisping, fanged snakes. Meiling screamed, just as several snakes struck into the air at her shouldn't-be-real body. A cry caught in her throat, and, as if responding to her own nightmares, the mist faded, and movement stretched for hundreds of li in either direction. Snakes of all shapes and sizes and colors. Some were as thick as her waist, while others were hardly longer than her hand. But then they shifted, and they were spiders. Huge, crawling, carnivorous spiders. The mist surrounding her was no longer mist, but silky, sticky, grasping spiderweb. It latched hold of her struggling limbs, pinning them in place until she couldn't move. She fought, pulled, but the more she resisted, the more the spiderweb caught hold of what shouldn't be real, until she was being bound up in a cocoon of webbing. Spiders started crawling upward toward her. Meiling screamed. "It's not real! It's not real!" she told herself. She was only spirit. She had no physical body they could harm. But these were not physical spiders. Did that mean they could kill her? Could the snakes... Did she see snakes slithering between the skittering, amassing spiders? Be as venomous to her soul as her body? It did not matter. The webs were not real. Perhaps she could be hurt, but she could not be confined. She could not be captured. With a scream of determination, she forced her mind, forced this world, to bend to what she knew to be true. She tore free of the bindings, shooting upward in the mist. But as she flew higher, the ground shifted below yet again. Peeling back layer after layer, flickers of weak and strong illusions, all fighting for ascendancy. Meiling squeezed her eyes shut. Darkness filled her vision. Blessed, uncomplicated, unshifting darkness. Her spirit heaved as though she ran for her life, terror shaping every thought. Nothing was solid here. Nothing was truly real. How far would she need to go to discover what was real? She kept her eyes shut until she could calm her frantic heart and her raging fears. Her own mind was safer than any other. She needed to stop trying to understand what was happening in this mind. She just needed to find his memories. Specific memories. She opened her eyes. The canyon had shifted once again. Snow fell from the sky, flickering into fire, then rain, then arrows. The walls moved. They had been moving this entire time, growing, shrinking, pressing in and out. Was it destroying memories? With the boundaries of the canyon always shifting, did it crush into oblivion the memories that lingered on the edge? It did not matter. She wasn't going to figure it out. There was no understanding the illusions threatening to overwhelm her. She wouldn't let the way that the canyon flickered back into a cave, then a garden, scare her. There had to be something true here, something that would guide her. This was someone's mind, after all. Not a monster's, a human's. If a human's thoughts were incohesive and shrouded in lies and laced with deception, surely there was something else. Meiling closed her eyes again. Darkness. There. Hovering above the illusion of the deadly canyon, with her vision cut off, something pulsed against her awareness. Emotions. How had she missed them before? They throbbed with such deep life and love, heartbreak and pain and sorrow. Emotions radiated and called to her from the canyon beyond. Emotions so strong, her heart might break with their burden. She chose an emotion. Or perhaps more aptly, an emotion chose her. Meiling wanted to sit and think and try to imagine what emotion might lead her to the information she needed, but there was no way she could guess. He could have been happy or sad or frustrated or anything when they camped for the night. Was there a way to access recent memories? It did not matter. The strongest emotion grabbed hold of her and pulled her at a dizzying speed down into the canyon, into the mist that wasn't mist. Sorrow. Meiling felt it before she saw it. Suddenly, she was a little girl. Meiling sat in a dark cave, thin little arms wrapped around her dirty, grimy body. Confusion beat through her heart. It was so dark, but Ma had said to wait here. So she did. She waited for her Ma to come back. It had been a very long time. But she waited patiently. Ma and Pa had gone into the back of the cave. She did not know why. She looked back the way they had come, hoping to see a sliver of light in the darkness. But there was no light. She waited and waited. Something wet ran into her feet. Water? It seemed warm for water. She touched it with her finger. It was sticky. Ma had said to wait. So she waited, even as the sticky, warm liquid pooled around her where she sat. She waited, and she thought about butterflies. Butterflies were beautiful. They never came back for her. Meiling gasped, suddenly freed of the memory. Her heart cried even as her mind wrestled with comprehending this memory. It felt so real, so like her own. This was a frequently accessed and also frequently suppressed memory. How Meiling knew that, she had no idea. It was a memory with memories, linked to even more memories. Grief, coping, wrestling. Strings like spider silk linked this memory to countless others, threatening to drag her through their ranks. She was never going to find what she looked for in this mind, not in a timely manner. She might lose her sanity and her heart might break into 1,000 pieces if she stayed to rifle these memories. If she continued to relive these memories as he had experienced them. She fled upward, desperate to be free, into the clouds, the moonlight, into the tree branches, through the top of that cave. Meiling spilled out of his mind, reeling with shock and horror. It was dark. It was night. Overhead, stars shone. They were speckling dots of light surrounding the moon. Evergreens stood tall around her. The 3 brigands lay below her, 2 asleep and 1 awake. She crumpled into a pile of shuddering spirit on the ground. Already, the things she had seen in his mind began slipping away. So much of it too strange for her to describe with words. While he slept, he looked so normal. Except for his pulsing rainbow glow, he looked like the fire wielder next to him, or even Shang. He was just a man. How did a man possess such a mind? How did he feel so deeply? How could he function while his mind stirred with madness? Meiling would have to enter a different mind. The wind wielder was still awake, still standing guard. Which would be better? A sleeping, dreaming mind? Or an awake, alert mind? It was riskier, but she decided an awake mind would be simpler. Slogging through one mind full of crumbling dreams was enough. She didn't want to. She wanted to hide, to find some time and space to be alone and process what she had experienced in the illusionist's mind. But she didn't have time. She slipped into the wind wielder's mind. She stood in the middle of a busy, bustling village. Women in colorful robes laughed as they walked by with baskets of food and jars of water. Children darted in between them, tripping and squealing. Men went about various tasks of varying importance. Down the street were two magic wielders. They wore the typical village patrol uniforms and badges on their belts. Wardens. It was so loud. Meiling strained, but the wind wielder's thoughts were lost in the cacophony of the village. "Shut up!" The order came booming from overhead, but the people didn't seem to hear. Instead, a huge gust of wind billowed through the village, making the people brace themselves. As soon as it passed, they returned to their business, quieter than before. Their faces weren't clear. When she tried to focus her gaze on any one person, they grew fuzzier. If she looked at the entire village, however, the people turned clear and solid. Find the memories. It was so easy to get distracted, but she needed to focus, needed to know if the brigands knew where they were. She floated down the street, uncertain and confused. The further she went, the louder the people grew, and the longer the village stretched out before her. Her brain turned muddled, once again overwhelmed. One mind was not made to comprehend another. On impulse, she floated up the steps to the front door of a thatched house. Not knowing what else to do, she peered into the open doorway. Light met her gaze, not the expected darkness of a dimly illuminated hut. And there was the wind wielder, kneeling before a tall man in a dark cloak. His robes were much finer than the wind wielder's, black and well-tailored to suit his tall frame. He struck Meiling as similar in age to her father, but the furs he wore around his shoulders and the tight braids lining his scalp were very different. He mumbled words in a foreign language, a language she was shocked to recognize, if not understand. It was the tongue of Butagan. He directed these words at a burly soldier behind him, wearing heavy pelts to ward off cold. Then he shifted his attention to the wind wielder and the two other brigands kneeling on either side of her, the illusionist and the fire wielder. He switched languages to Meiling's familiar tongue.
Be swift, my friends. Every minute you are gone is a minute that delays our freedom. Complete my collection of wielders with the healer, the guardian, and the princess. The empire of Juninghai has ruled long enough on the blood and tears of the weak. It's time to show them what true magic and true power are.
Meiling clung to the doorframe. She tried to get a good glimpse of the tall man, but the closer she looked at him, the blurrier he became. This woman remembered impressions then, not details. This had the feeling of a recent memory. She fled away from it. Despite her fear, her mind struggled to understand this dream, to understand how she might find what she needed. She floated again amid the street, people wafting like specters past her. There had to be a faster way than flitting door to door. How did she recall information and memories to her own mind? The din of the village grew louder again. Meiling almost screamed in frustration for them to be quiet so she could think. But that would betray her presence in this mind. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her frenzied spirit. She pictured moonlight, the stars above her, and the tension eased slightly. Could she use her own thoughts to direct this mind to show her what she wanted? Phoenixes scorch complicated minds. Dragons eat unorganized thoughts. It would be far easier to access Shang's memories. An undercurrent of anxiety blew by on a gust of wind, toppling baskets of food and blowing children's hats away. Meiling froze as the stench of smoke wafted past her. She could smell here. It was a startling realization that only served to discombobulate her further. Then, An audible thought.
They must be nearby. We have to find them. If she gets to that fortress first.
The wind grew stronger, washing away the anxiety with determination. The determination smelled like strong, cold iron.
We'll get them.
That was it. That was what Meiling had been hunting for. The brigands did not know where they were. They knew they were close and where they were going, but they didn't know their exact location. She whirled upward, out of that mind, then stared down at the 3 figures below her. Even a few minutes inside a mind betrayed much about a person. Her gaze lingered on the one brigand whose mind she had not braved. The fire wielder. The one with the burning red eyes. Perhaps another time she would have that pleasure. She fled back to the cave. Chapter 30. Should she wake Shang and Fen? They could get a head start on the brigands. Maybe it would give them the one sliver of advantage they needed against their foes. Meiling ducked into the cave's entrance, flying toward the light of the dying fire and the 3 slumbering figures around it. She jolted involuntarily, the image of her and Shang sleeping bringing back a rush of memories. His gentle words, warm touch, calling her sweet Meiling. Things that she didn't have time to process right now. She returned to her body. It took everything to suppress her groan and peel her salt-crusted eyelids open. What had been a blessedly painless existence only a second ago was now an awareness full of aching and blurry vision. Carefully, to not rouse Shang, she lifted her head from his chest and disentangled herself from his arm. She shivered, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders and getting to her feet. She hadn't expected to feel so bereft. But that wasn't important right now. She grabbed her water skin and poured a stream of water on the fire to snuff it. With its last embers dead, the cave plunged into pitch darkness. She shuddered, searching with wide eyes, but even the prick of moonlight from the cave's opening wasn't enough. Half awake and half dead, she crawled on hands and knees to Shang's side, hoping she wouldn't accidentally bump into him in the process. His gaze was turned so she could barely see it. His brow had smoothed, the tension finally gone from his body. He slept soundly, sweetly, soaking up the rest he so desperately needed. Meiling's tongue caught in her mouth. Her hand hovered over his arm, ready to gently rouse him. But his face... She couldn't do it. Her hand fell back to her side. He would hate her for this. He would get up, sling Fen over his infected shoulder, and drag them to die of injuries and exhaustion mere hours from their destination. More than anything right now, they all needed sleep. Brigands or no brigands, they could not outrun anyone in their current state. They would have a better chance after a few hours of rest. Shang would kill her in the morning. But he would only have the strength to do so because she let him sleep. She, on the other hand, had nothing left. She crumpled to the floor where she was, by Shang's knees, and immediately fell asleep again. "Wake up," she whispered. Shang's lids fluttered. His mouth opened. She clamped both her hands down over it. His eyes widened, then narrowed. One hand came up and grabbed her wrist, about to wrench her grip away. "Brigands," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're near." Shang's eyes widened again. He pulled her hands away from his mouth and was immediately captain of their group again, drawing himself to his feet with hardly a grimace.
How close?
"A few li would be my guess," Meiling said. "But I'm not good at estimating. They're in the forest. They don't know where we are, But they do know we're going to Liafugan.
Are they searching for us?
They're asleep.
Do we have time to pack up?
I already did. We only need to get Fen up. Shang blinked. He cast a look around the campsite, over at Fen's sleeping body. His gaze shifted back to Meiling, lips parting. He swallowed and turned away from her, clearing his throat softly.
You should have woken me sooner. I would have helped.
It was still dark, but she could have sworn his ears flushed red. Was he remembering last night? It was just packing things in bags, Meiling said briskly, hoping his mind was still too sleep-fogged to notice the weariness in her tone. We need your strength for things like lifting Fen. He knelt beside Fen, frowning.
How do you know that they know our destination?
I went into their minds last night. She couldn't help her shudder and how her head shook from side to side. Terrible minds. Yours is so much cleaner. He blinked in surprise, raising an eyebrow, pausing with his hand on Fen's shoulder. He opened his mouth, then closed it.
I suppose I am flattered.
Meiling blushed, feeling suddenly foolish. But Shang did not seem to notice, preoccupied with trying to lift Fen. Within a few minutes, they were mounted up and riding again, the sky still dark with night. Meiling directed them silently, giving a wide berth around the area where the brigands slept. Fen moaned softly, and Shang clamped a frantic hand over her mouth. She wriggled in his arms in response, brow furrowing tightly. Would this be enough of an advantage to ensure their safe arrival at the fortress today? The Windwielder seemed to believe that stealing her out of the fortress would be nigh impossible, which was very encouraging at least. Once they were there, they'd be safe. Once they were an hour or two past the brigands' campsite, Shang spoke, tilting around Fen's lolling, groaning head.
Did you learn anything else in the brigands' minds?
They rode side by side now. His hair was a mess, several days' growth of stubble on his jaw, but instead of making him appear haggard, it made him seem harder, more dangerous. He eyed Meiling with a sidelong glance. I did, she said softly, her brow wrinkling as she tried to form cohesive thought from what she had seen. It was so strange. The illusionist's mind, it was illusion upon illusion, and if it hadn't been for Fei Yen, I wouldn't have found his memories at all. Shang looked at her with something between awe, terror, and complete bewilderment.
The healer?
Meiling shook her head, pressing her fist to the space between her eyes, squeezing her eyes shut. Those images played out before her memory, of Fei Yen's running, flickering shadow. How could she describe it? I think she was a memory.
What?
I think her memory betrayed him, Meiling said with a wince. Her mind constricted tightly, painfully. She shook her head again. The illusionist's mind. I didn't end up finding much of importance there. It was too confusing. He nodded hesitantly. I found something in the Windwielder's mind, however. It was a memory of their leader. He spoke the native tongue of Butagan. He was tall and very fuzzy. All of them. Everything was fuzzy. But he mentioned the healer and me.
You?
Shang's face darkened, his arm tightening around Fen's waist. I assume he meant me, considering that the brigands are now hunting me and not my sister, that I am aware. The thought of little Hao being hunted made Meiling's heart clench. He said to find the princess to add... Her voice trailed off. It was almost too strange to say. But Shang's eyes bored a hole through the side of her face, and she had to finish, even if she didn't want to. to add to his collection of wielders. She peeked at Shang. He faced forward, light blazing from his black eyes. His jaw worked. "You know what is going on, don't you?" she said. "From your independent research?" He acknowledged her question with one brief sidelong glance. "You know who the man was. You know why he wants me."
The man is likely Fong Tsedong,
Shang said coldly.
Magic wielders have been disappearing from across the Empire, vanishing from their posts and appointments without a trace.
"What?" Meiling breathed. "How do you know this? How does no one else know this?"
Some people know, but not many. It's been a secret for years now, as the Emperor's spies try to uncover the truth.
He shifted Fen in his arms, and pain flashed across his face.
Fong is the one behind the amassing armies of barbarians in the north. There's long been a suspicion that he is behind these disappearances, even though no one could prove it. Some thought the disappearing wielders were defectors.
He tossed her a dry look.
These abductions might suggest otherwise. Nothing is certain, but there are rumors he has learned by some dark magic how to harness other wielders' powers against their will.
His voice lowered, and he glanced up at the foliage arching above them.
It is also rumored that he can enhance their powers.
"Like the brigands," she breathed. "That's what Fen was talking about."
Fen didn't know what she was talking about. But yes, that is what she noticed.
Meiling paused, her mind working through the implications behind his words. Suddenly, she looked up. "You knew. From the beginning. Or at least, from the inn. Who was pursuing us. That was why you were so suspicious of me." Her horse's hoof caught on a rock and slid slightly beneath her. The air fled her lungs, her heart lurching as she caught the reins harder. "How do you know all this?" He gave her another sidelong glance.
I make it a point to understand the dangers my country faces.
That wasn't an answer.
Your mother.
He started, then stopped. Meiling whirled. "What about my mother? What does she have to do with anything?" His black eyes met hers.
Rumor has it that she was friends with this Fong Tsedong while he was at the academy.
The way he said friends made something dark as night slide down her spine. For the first time, a deep-seated fear squelched her curiosity. She didn't want to know what he meant. In fact, she would rather know just about anything else in the world. Had there been someone before Pa? If so, why had he defected from the academy? It seemed impossible that someone as good and kind as Ma could have any connection to an academy deserter, much less one who currently worked to capture magic wielders. There was a story here, one she didn't know. However the dynamic had played out, it hadn't just been Ma and Pa. There had been someone else. This Fong Tsedong.
She tells security her visions, you know.
Shang continued.
I don't know if she tells all, but she tells many. Good and bad.
Why? The words slipped out of her mouth unbidden. That is, if they are glimpses of the future, then what would be the purpose of sharing? If it's going to happen anyway.
Not all visions tell the future. Sometimes they are warnings. Things that could happen.
How do you know the difference? She asked. He shrugged his good shoulder.
A high magic seer can tell.
But Ma was a low magic seer. Why did Mei Ling feel the anger rising in her breast at the thought of her mother being a low magic wielder? Why did it bother her? Because Ma was not defined by her magical abilities. To classify her as a low magic wielder was to lock her in a cage she did not belong in. "How does Feng Zedong know of my magic?" she asked. "No one knows except me and my parents. And now you and Fen."
"Two of the missing wielders are high seers. He might have used them to discover the wielders he wanted to capture. You could have been one of them."
Shang kicked his horse faster up a steep incline. She followed, leaning forward in the saddle to keep from falling backwards off the horse. "But why?"
"He's building an army."
Her breath came faster. But Zhenning Hai is the largest empire in the world. Butagan cannot compare in strength. How could... Shang's hand fisted tighter around the reins.
"That seems to be where you fit in."
Her? What advantage could she give Butagan over Zhenning Hai? Capturing the healer was obvious. No one else could heal with a touch like she could. She'd be a valuable asset in a war. But Meiling? Fen interrupted her thoughts with a moan. "Idiot." She slurred the word, making it sound more like idiots. "May your souls burn in DU. May you get lost in labyrinths for all eternity."
"Harsh curses for your saviors,"
Shang muttered. "May phoenixes rend your soul!" she shouted, suddenly lurching forward in the saddle. Shang caught her, wrapping his arms around her torso to restrain her as her head thrashed, trying to bash into his.
"Hush, Fen. Hush, hush."
She fought harder, and even in her weakened state, she was surprisingly strong. Not stronger than Shang, but enough to make him struggle to keep her in the saddle.
"Meiling,"
he called, glancing back at her.
"Calm her."
She hurried forward, sidling along Shang's horse. "Shh," she soothed, reaching out for one of Fen's hands. Fen yanked against her touch and moaned at the pain. Then her eyes burst wide, unseeing, and she screamed. That scream echoed into the forest, bouncing off the eastward rock face and footholds of the mountains. Silence descended on the trees around them, winding, swallowing all noise. Like the silence of death, of the terror before death. Fen slumped back against Shang's arms. He turned horrified eyes to Meiling, even as dread and terror roiled in her gut. "Maybe the brigands didn't hear," she whispered. Shang looked at her, hopelessness writhing in his gaze. She felt faint suddenly.
"Hurry."
Shang leaned forward, holding a now limp Fen close, and kicked his horse into a gallop. Meiling raced after him. Dread filled her from head to toe. Any moment she imagined the brigands to come bursting out in front of them, flinging incinerating fireballs and sucking the air out of their lungs. And that illusionist. Meiling shuddered again at the memory of his mind. What was something with that sort of mind capable of? Something blue glittered in front of them. Shang dragged his horse to a staggering halt, and Meiling went shooting past him, unable to control her horse like him.
"Meiling!"
he cried. She was finally able to stop, right in front of a large, glittering dragon. Its eyes glittered like multifaceted jewels, and it cocked its head to stare down at her, its reptilian body moving with deadly grace. It flapped waxy wings, spreading them wide and high. It opened its mouth. There was light, fire building at the back of its throat.
"Meiling!"
Shang snatched Beak's bridle and pulled them out of the way as the blast flew wide. The dragon shrieked and flew into the air, circling and aiming. Shang quickly gathered himself, whipping a jian from his saddle and slamming 2 arrows into it. He glanced down at Fen frantically, then at Meiling, then at the dragon overhead. "It's scared of us!" Meiling shouted, tugging at him. "We need to run!"
"It'll pursue!"
The dragon wheeled and twisted in the air, charging straight for her. It opened its gaping, fanged mouth. Shang tried to grab her, but she leaned down and spurred her horse into a gallop, barely dodging the burst of flame. Beak whinnied, tossing his head as a wave of heat washed over them. But Meiling didn't slow, and soon Shang was galloping beside her. He leaned close to his horse's neck, keeping Fen close as he gripped his loaded jian in his other hand. They rode hard. Shang frequently looked back to see if the dragon pursued them. Meiling focused on riding. It wouldn't come after them. They could not sustain travel at this pace. Too soon they were forced to slow. Her heart hammered in her throat. Shang looked wild, overcome by his warrior instinct. He glanced down at Fen in his arms. She would be the death of them. Shang gasped heavily and lifted his hand to briefly touch his injured shoulder. Suddenly, he seemed more exhausted than ever. How was he standing the pain? How could they make it? They had to make it. They would make it. Any minute, the brigands could descend upon them. Any minute, a Mwagwe they could not fight could emerge from the depths of the forest. Every shadow, sound, and slight disturbance sent Meiling's blood surging through her veins. For hours they rode in silence, nerves jumpy. The moment a branch cracked, Shang whirled with a fistful of ice. Once he glanced at Meiling. There was too much in those eyes. He was stretched almost to the breaking point, but he would get them to the fortress if it killed him. This was his duty, after all. His life was forfeit if he failed. They could not fail. They would make it. Each minute was an hour. Each hour was a decade. Time dripped by like thick blood in between their fingers. Agonizingly slow.
"We're almost there,"
Shang whispered suddenly. Meiling looked up just as they emerged from the forest. Ahead, on the crest of a hill far away, but still within view, stood a tall, proud, mighty fortress. Its walls were strong, its towers high. Their beloved flag flew from each tower, brilliant crimson waving in the wind. Meiling gasped. A bubbling, desperate laugh escaped her lips. "We've made it!" His eyes narrowed.
"Not quite yet."
In front of them stretched a lush green valley. A deep chasm cut through the center of the valley, with a long bridge stretching over it to a road that led up the hill to the fortress.
"Just a few more hours,"
Shang mumbled. Relief lined his face, but it was hesitant, unlike hers. I can't believe we've almost made it, Shang! It's so close!" Meiling was laughing outright now. "All that and we're finally almost here! It's so close! I've never been so impatient to arrive in my entire life! We can get the care you need for your shoulder, and we can save Fen." Shang tilted his head around Fen's to look at her. His face was still very guarded, but he smiled. At Meiling. It was better than how she had imagined, better than even the fox spirit's portrayal of his smile. It was a little crooked, and it stretched his upper lip thin until it almost disappeared. This smile was so much more real, so much warmer, so much more perfectly imperfect. It ensnared her, like a beautiful soprano voice might halt her tracks, make her lean closer to appreciate it more. Her cheeks flushed with a pleasant warmth, her stomach stirring as her own hesitant smile grew in response to his.
"Let's hurry,"
he said, and looked away. She ducked her head to hide her blush, pulling her cloak tighter around her, which was stupid because she was warmer than she had been all day.
"You never told me what you wanted to do with your life."
Shang's voice broke through the silence that had fallen.
Since we're so close, I might not have another chance to ask.
Her eyes snapped to his, but he was not looking at her. He stared straight ahead at the bridge they needed to cross to reach the fortress. He was right. Once they arrived, what opportunities would they have to see each other? Not many. After all, Shang and Fen were only her protectors. They were not her friends. With how treacherous these last few days had become, she'd been so consumed with thoughts of just arriving. They had to get to the fortress. It was a matter of life and death. She could not think past arriving. Now that she stared up at that bulwark on a hill, what sort of life awaited her inside? Would she be able to visit Fen and Shang as they recovered from their wounds? What if one of them took a turn for the worst? What if Shang's body gave out after the strain he'd borne these last few days? No, she couldn't think like that. They would heal. There was no other option. What happened once they did heal? Would they stay at the fortress? Surely not. They would make their journey back to Suguan and would salvage their careers. Shang would try to recover his dream appointment. Fen's battalion would have left without her by now, so she'd have to... Pa would make sure they were rewarded. But how much reward could he give to them after completing a journey this secretive? When the time came, other wielders she did not know would escort her home. She would do this all over again, but with new people who did not know about her magic and who still thought of her as the cursed princess. There was the added concern that now other people knew about her magic. What if it got out somehow, despite Shang's promise? What if her magic was found out, and she had to face trial for being an illegal magic wielder? Suddenly, the fortress did not seem quite so welcoming as before.
Meiling?
Shang prompted after her silence stretched long. She turned to him and suddenly remembered his question. Oh, forgive me. I was thinking.
I noticed.
She glanced at him. He didn't give her that cold stare she was so used to. His gaze, it was not hostile. It was almost gentle. Not quite, but almost.
Your life. You want something else,
he said. She glanced down, found herself fingering the edges of her cloak and the stitching in the saddle.
I told you mine.
He raised an eyebrow.
It's only fair if you tell me yours.
Yours was easy, she retorted, because yours is something you can do, something you will do. I know you will reach your ambitions. It's not the same for me. His face took on a strange expression. She didn't know what it meant.
That's unfortunate,
he said at last.
Because you're still in my debt. So you must tell me. Silly or bold or ridiculous, you're obligated.
Was he teasing her? Or just prodding her for information? Why must her hot cheeks keep betraying her? I'll tell you, only if you promise me something, she said, her voice unintentionally growing quieter. He craned his neck to hear and nodded. No holding this over my head like my magic. Understand? She tried, and probably failed, to make herself look fierce. He smiled again. It was a small smile, but it was still a smile, and Meiling was still lost when it fixed on her.
You're stalling,
he said. If I say it, you're going to think it's anticlimactic.
Still stalling.
But...
Meiling!
He was grinning now.
Stop overthinking everything.
She wanted to draw back, to be insulted. But she couldn't. Not when he smiled. And then the words were tumbling free, despite herself. I want to see things. I want to experience places across the empire, across the world. I want to see different places and different people, hear different languages. I don't want to do it at night while I sleep. I want to do it in my physical body so I can smell and taste and feel. I want to read everything I can, and then I want to see it. I want to know things because I've lived them. There's so much beauty in the world, and I can see pictures of it in the palace, but I want to see it with my eyes, in the sunlight, touch it with my hands and feel the wind in my hair and the ground beneath my feet. Now that she'd started, she couldn't stop. I cannot go far in my dreams, you see. I'm restrained by my tether, and it won't let me go. I want to be free to find beauty. She stopped, caught a gasping breath. She wanted to look at Shang, but she was too afraid. He must think her silly, ridiculous. There was no hope for such a life for her. Not when she was the cursed princess cooped up at the palace. Not when she was doomed to live in a world where she would be forever defined by what she was not. Not when she was destined to redeem herself through the bearing of magical children.
I hope you can,
Shang said. The softness in his voice surprised her. She still couldn't bring herself to look at him. He might be watching her carefully, or perhaps he focused on the horizon, on their destination. She was too much of a coward to find out. For one who could enter minds at will while she slept, she could not guess what thoughts rushed through Shang's head, what he might be feeling. The bridge loomed ahead of them, still so far away. It was still so far away. When would they arrive? When could they be done with this journey? When would she say goodbye to Shang? She should not care. It did not matter. But she did care. It did matter. It mattered so much. A tear slid down her cheek. She allowed no more to fall. There was no point in discussing what would happen after they reached the fortress. Meiling knew as well as Shang what was to be generally expected. She would be sequestered for her safety, protected by strangers, loved and cared for by no one. Shang would leave. She would likely never see him again except at festivals or banquets, but even that was very unlikely. How often did she see magic wielders besides the palace guard and the emperor's guard? Especially young wielders, new graduates? Not very often. Perhaps in many years, when Shang inevitably rose through the ranks, she would see him more often. He would wear distinguishing robes with a red sash. He would marry, of course, some beautiful, magically talented girl with skill and honor to her name. Perhaps another ice wielder to preserve the bloodline. And Meiling would wait, until some foolhardy graduate would approach the emperor for the hand of his daughter. How long until that happened? He had already received requests for Hao's hand, young as she was. But as far as Meiling knew, no requests had come for her. Perhaps she would see Shang again at a festival. The Festival of New Lights, or maybe next year's graduation. There would be another celebration at the palace, one cramped with bodies in fine embroidered robes. Perfume and the scent of melted wax would fill the room. She'd be there because she was obligated to, but she would stand at the back of the room, watching for a familiar face among the sea of nobility. The usual shroud of discomfort and lostness would settle on her shoulders. Every time she moved, she'd be wary of casting her shadow too long. Then she would look up, and he'd be there. He'd be tall and handsome and strong and everything he was supposed to be. And the thing was, she knew he'd notice her. He noticed everything. She wouldn't be invisible to him. He'd see her and meet her gaze. It might be months later, or it might be years, but their eyes would meet again, and she'd fall into those black depths. Memories of these weeks, of working and struggling together, of their kiss, and everything else would pass between them. He would nod once, acknowledging her, but he wouldn't approach her. He would turn back to his conversation, his own duties, as he always had. After all, she would no longer be his duty. And her? Well, she would watch the world unfold from the shadows, just as she always had. They rode in silence, penetrating, heavy, deepening silence. Down into the valley, their horses clambered. Meiling clutched the reins, squeezing her knees into the horse's side, and tried not to be flung headlong. Fenn's head sagged in front of Shang. He looked weary as he tried to hold her up. Just a little farther. They reached the valley. Their horses' hooves sank slightly into the soft grass. It was so beautiful, it made her already aching heart ache just that much more. "Shang, do you—" she started to ask, turning toward him. He froze. He pulled his horse to a stop, his face gone ashen. Meiling knew before she slowly turned her head. She knew it in the pit of her stomach, driving like a knife into her gut. Her chest constricted and simultaneously loosened with imminent dread. Ahead, standing between them and the bridge suspended over the chasm, standing between them and safety, between them and freedom, stood two brigands. Red eyes glowed beneath a low-pulled hood.
"You have finally arrived. And now you have no choice. No more running,"
he rumbled, his voice like the clashing of burning, sparking coal.
"We fight."
Chapter 31. Shang cast a look toward Meiling. More than the sight of the fierce brigands blocking their path, that look shot terror into her heart. He thought, he knew, he was going to die. "No, Shang," she breathed. His jaw hardened, his eyes turning to flint, and he leapt down from his horse, facing their enemies. Meiling scrambled off her horse to catch Fenn's body before she fell. Her weight was too much, and Meiling only succeeded in shielding her body from the most of the impact. The horses bucked in terror as she crouched over Fenn. She pulled Fenn's moaning head into her lap. Tears splashed onto her face. "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you," she soothed, even though Fenn was not the one terrified out of her mind. She almost did not want to look up to see what was happening. But then a shock rushed through her body and a spasm followed it. The illusionist. Where was the illusionist? She gritted her teeth against the whizzing buzz of Shang's ice. He might be sorely outmatched, but Meiling wasn't about to give up. Not yet. She couldn't lift Fenn into the saddle of the horse. She also knew that she could not sit here, waiting for the brigands to kill Shang and then come to finish Fenn and capture her. Her own life, Meiling realized with a dull thud, was not in danger. Fenn's was. Fenn, who lay in a stupor in her arms. Every moment they stayed here was another moment Shang was in danger. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the clash of magic, the whoosh of sucking wind. How long did they have until the wind wielder managed to snatch away Shang's air and leave him choking at her feet? How long could he delay the inevitable? No, she wouldn't let her fear for him paralyze her. She latched her arms under Fenn's armpits, ignoring her sudden cry of pain. She glanced around frantically. Behind and on either side of her rolled the open valley. No place to hide except perhaps on the far side of a single tree. Not a viable option. That left the bridge. Could she drag Fen around the fighting, over the bridge, and up the hill to the fortress? She had no other option. With a guttural roar that hardly sounded like her own, she heaved Fen up and ran backward toward the fighting. She dragged with all her might, ignoring the shaking of her limbs. Adrenaline raced and pulsed, and all she could think about was running. Shang cried out. She wouldn't look. She ground her teeth together, biting her lip, letting the blood flow. Tears flowed too, but she wouldn't look. She dragged and dragged. The sound of the battle grew louder in her ears, clashing without rhythm. Wind almost knocked her over, but she would not let them take Fen too. They would have to kill her before she let them have Fen. Shang would die for her. She wasn't about to let Fen die too. Another cry from Shang pierced the air, another knife to Meiling's heart. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept dragging, even as her back threatened to buckle from the strain. She glanced to find she was almost upon the fighting. Shang spotted her, saw what she was trying to do. In response, he stumbled back, drawing the fight away from the bridge. To give her a chance. He nearly paid for it with a fireball to the face, but he threw himself to the ground, rolling and springing back up as he sent ice flying. Meiling stumbled, landed hard on the ground. Then she was up again, gasping as she dragged Fen. Why did Fen have to be so tall, so densely muscled? In the corner of her eye, Shang staggered. She was almost to the bridge. She looked back toward it. A figure stood on the bridge, watching the battle raging between ice, wind, and fire. She'd never caught a clear glimpse of his face. Until now. It was strangely beautiful, as though painted by a master painter. Where Shang was severe lines and harsh cuts, this man's features were finer, more delicate, fuller, softer. His eyes latched on hers, full of whirling chaos. She recognized him instantly. The illusionist. Meiling's feet betrayed her, and she stumbled to the ground. She lay there, frozen, for an instant, as their eyes met. The vivid, unnatural, stunning beauty of his mind shone through his irises, giving her once more a glimpse of a child's sorrow. A dark night in a cave, alone and abandoned. Meiling searched a little deeper, and there was Fei Yen's shadow, betraying him. There he was, dragging her away from a battle, carrying her despite how much she fought him. And then Meiling understood. The one truth of his soul flashed through his eyes, and it almost seemed ridiculous now how obvious it had been in his mind. It couldn't be true, couldn't be possible. And yet, he loved Fei Yen, the girl he'd kidnapped, the healer he had broken. Regret spilled like bloody tears down his cheeks. Meiling's mouth formed the words she could not utter. Help us. He understood. Then she was leaping to her feet again, dragging Fen after her. The illusionist stepped aside, looking past her to the battle raging, creating illusions to kill Shang. Except, Meiling glanced back. Shang's ice bolts and shards flew true, striking and wounding. Gusts of wind caught his feet, wiping him flat on his back, but never grabbing at his lungs. Fireballs arced wide, narrowly missing him. The illusionist helped Shang. Even though he bled from multiple wounds and staggered, he was still alive. He should have been dead long ago. It was too bizarre for her comprehension. Meiling pulled Fen onto the bridge. It was surprisingly narrow, but bless the fathers, it was not a rope bridge. She pulled with all her strength, dragging Fen along the wooden planks.
Don't let her escape!
The shout came from the battle. The illusionist turned toward Meiling, and a battle raged in his eyes. Her breath caught as his eyes slowly blackened, hardened, the light fleeing. He lunged toward her. His illusion snapped. His focus was broken. Shang's cry cut off abruptly. Meiling should run as fast as her legs could take her, should give up Fen for dead and run for her life to the fortress. She shouldn't care. Fen shouldn't matter. Shang shouldn't matter. But they did matter. There had never been a moment when they hadn't mattered to her. Even when Fen had been cruel to her, even when Shang had been cold, she had always cared. She cared even more now. She would not leave Fen. Even if hope was gone for Shang, she could save Fen. Just maybe. Meiling's eyes betrayed her. She looked past the illusionist running for her. She looked past the bridge, past the brigands. She looked and found Shang clutching his throat on all fours. His eyes were wide with panic. His life was being stolen right in front of her. Meiling looked down at Fen's limp form that she held, and her frantic mind cleared. She screamed with all her might, "Let him go!" The wind wielder's hold broke with a startle, and Shang sagged, gasping and choking. The illusionist reached for her, long fingers extending to wrap around her arm. "Stay back!" she shouted at him, whipping out her penknife. She pressed the knife to her own chest. The illusionist froze. The brigands stopped. "I will kill myself," Meiling seethed. "I swear to you upon everything that is good in this world. I will kill myself if you don't let these two go." The words were pouring out of her mouth, and she meant every word more than she'd ever meant any words in her life.
You won't kill yourself,
the red-eyed brigand snarled. He raised a fireball over Shang's head. Despite how her heart hammered viciously in her breast, despite how tears streamed down her cheeks, Meiling pushed the blade. She cried out as the blade pierced skin and blood flowed. The wind wielder knocked his arm aside. "Stop! She's doing it!" Meiling's voice quivered. Her hands trembled so hard she could hardly keep the sharp point of the knife pressed into her chest. Her heart throbbed with such life and fear and pain. "Let them go," she threatened, gasping when she made good on her threat, pushing the blade a hair deeper until more blood flowed.
Meiling, stop!
It was Shang's choking, broken voice. "Let them go! Swear to me that you will let them go! You won't kill them!" Meiling snarled. "You want me, not them! Let them go!" The illusionist's beautiful face was contorted in shock and bewilderment. It was almost as if he could not think straight. She did not want to know what roiled in that wild mind of his.
She's bluffing,
the fire wielder growled. "I don't care," the wind wielder snapped back. She shouted to Meiling. "You for them. That's the only deal we're making." "Deal," Meiling said without hesitating. "But the moment you lay another hand on my friends, I will kill myself."
"Run, you fool!"
Shang shouted, coughing, sputtering, as he pushed up on his elbows. She leaned down to brush a lock of Fen's hair out of her face. Fen blinked wide-eyed at her, uncomprehending. "Phoenixes scorch your brains for dragging me," she growled. Then her eyes closed, and she slumped on the bridge. There was nothing else Meiling could do for her. She stood and glared at the illusionist blocking her path. "Move aside." The illusionist stepped out of the way, but watched her closely. She kept her knife near her bleeding chest, poised and ready. She walked down the short length of bridge she had managed and stepped down the grassy side of the valley. Shang breathed heavily on all fours. His shirt was torn where something sharp had pierced his forearm, not fire, and the blood darkened his garments. Other parts of his clothes had been burned away, revealing scorched flesh beneath. Bloodthirst burned in the fire-wielder's gaze. The hard-nosed wind-wielder at his side seemed to be the only thing restraining him from burning Shang into oblivion. How could she ensure they'd let him go? Shang struggled to lift his head and look at Meiling. His eyes were so black, so pained, so despairing.
Meiling,
he choked.
Don't!
She wanted to rush to his side, to whisper soothing words that she would be fine, but the fire-wielder reached out and snatched her arm. He dragged her to him and yanked the knife out of her hand. With one move, he flung it into the gaping chasm below.
Take her.
He shoved her to the wind-wielder.
I'll get rid of the others.
No! Meiling screamed, fight surging through her limbs as she struggled against the wind-wielder's iron grip. You said—
Zhuogong, stop!
The wind-wielder snarled.
What? Why?
Don't let them off so easily. Make them face their emperor alive. Make them suffer for failing to protect his daughter. They want to blindly serve that emperor, so let them. Let them see how it feels to have the empire you served turn on you. Meiling's blood ran cold. Oh, father, she was right. That was what Pa had told Fen, that their lives were forfeit if they failed. They were going to die anyway. But now, instead of dying honorably to save her, they'd be punished. Stripped of everything. No, she said, as if that could make this nightmare go away. Pa wouldn't kill her friends, would he? The wind-wielder's voice darkened behind her. Besides, someone has to tell the emperor that Feng Tsadong declares war. And then she was being dragged away from Shang, from Fen, from the fortress. She glanced up the hill. Were those warriors streaming out of the fortress? They'd never reach her in time.
Meiling!
Shang sputtered, reaching a limp arm after her.
Don't be stupid!
Zhuogong shoved her hard to her knees, and a little cry escaped her lips as he yanked her wrists painfully behind her. Her eyes locked on Shang's stricken expression as Zhuogong bound her wrists so tightly the rope sliced into her skin. Blood still oozed from her chest, staining the front of her tunic. She went lightheaded, dizziness almost turning her vision black. This wasn't happening. They'd been so close. They were so close. Somehow her mouth was moving, forming words meant for Shang. Everything will be fine. I know what I am doing.
No!
He shouted, dragging himself upward on one elbow.
You have absolutely no idea what you're doing!
Zhuogong yanked her to her feet, roughly dragging her with burning hands. The illusionist grabbed Meiling's spotted horse and brought it near for them to load up their prisoner.
Don't hurt her!
Shang cried. Desperation ringed his eyes like a deadly winter. Meiling could hardly bring herself to look at him, but she could not look at him. She held his gaze, willing him to not look so horrified, so desperate, so frantic.
Don't hurt her,
Zhuogong sneered.
like this.
Before she could brace herself, his fist swung. Fire burst on her cheek, and she fell to the ground under the shock and force of his blow. She braced herself, hair falling in her face, gasping in air as she stared at the grass beneath her. Her new burn throbbed as her head reeled. Shang let out a strangled, unintelligible cry. Enough games. They're coming. It's time to go. The wind-wielder yanked Meiling back to her feet. Within seconds, she was forced into the saddle, bound so tightly she couldn't hope for escape. She was vaguely aware of Fen screaming. She was in a fog. She twisted back and caught one last glimpse of Shang's strong, broken body lying defeated on the ground. His black eyes burned in her memory. Then they were galloping away, to whatever fate lay waiting for Meiling. At least someone had seen the fighting. At least some wielders were coming. At least they would find Fen and Shang and would tend their wounds, even if they could not reach the brigands. Even if they could not save her. At least what? The fortress on the hill faded from view. Back into the forest, back into the Mwagwe-ridden countryside she'd just escaped. At least none of them had died. Yet. Epilogue. They traveled up a steep, winding road. It played out in front of Meiling's eyes like a reflection of the last time she had seen Shang and Fen. They rode up to a hilltop fortress, black and fortified and imposing. A foreign flag waved in its towers. The air was notably cooler. She wanted to pull the tatters of her cloak around her shoulders, but with her hands bound behind her, she could do nothing except let the wind whip it around wildly. Zhuogang took the lead, his narrow shoulders pushed back to make him seem more threatening than he was. His red eyes blazed with triumph as the large gates and portcullis opened and several figures emerged. Ling, the wind wielder, held the lead of Meiling's horse and cast hostile glares her way every so often. For one with such a loud, hectic mind, she was definitely the most reasonable of the three. Shuzhen, the illusionist, followed. His face was downcast when Meiling peeked back at him. He was the quietest and had hardly spoken this entire time. He did what was asked of him, working silently and keeping to the fringes. They had hardly encountered any Mwagwe because he drew them away with his illusions. As they approached, a strange smell caught her nostrils. She wrinkled her eyebrows. It was a smell unlike anything she had ever smelled before, yet a smell she almost recognized from a dream. A dissonant smell. Drums pulsed as they drew her. Thump, thump, thump. They hammered relentlessly as they approached. The closer they got, the better she could make out the tall figure in black robes waiting for them. His legs were braced wide, and a black cloak flowed in the wind behind him. He was smiling, grinning even. Fang Tsarang. Thump, 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 the drums beat, pulsing in time to her raging heartbeat and ragged breaths. Then, silence. He stepped forward and began clapping.
Ah, my guest of honor has arrived. Princess Meiling, cherished daughter of Queen Lu Liana, and the final piece to my puzzle. My sweet girl, you do not know how much I've longed for this day.
He reached her side, smiling up at her like she was an old friend. It quickly morphed into a frown.
What? Devils you are indeed. Why do you bind my princess?
It wasn't his physical appearance that struck her. His face was rather plain, with rounded cheeks, a rounded jaw, and thin, scraggly eyebrows. His skin was pale, like he spent too much time safe in his fortress, cooped up in an office. But his height was impressive, and his build reminded her of Shang, slender and muscular. He was, after all, a former academy student. It appeared he had kept up his training through the past 20 years. His hair was cut short, which surprised her, and instead of the typical queue, his scalp was lined with thin, tight braids. The beard lining his jaw was neatly trimmed. At this proximity, she could tell how finely tailored his garments were. A gold clasp in the shape of a flower kept his cloak from blowing away across the hillside. A lotus. Around his throat was a rough brown cord with a single wooden bead hanging from it. His eyes were striking blue. A bad omen. Meiling was not usually superstitious. Rather exhausted she was at being the object of it. But those strange blue eyes, was there movement behind them? They shone far too brightly. What lurked in his mind? But even more striking than his eyes was the sheer magnitude of his presence. Power billowed out from him like ocean waves, rippling through the air between them. He cut the cords digging into her wrists. The moment they were free, he snatched one numb hand and pressed his lips to their bloody filth. Her mouth opened, startled. He slowly lifted his mouth and his eyes upward from her hands and smiled at her.
Surprised you recognize her under all that dirt,
Zhuogong muttered. Sadong's grin widened. Meiling's skin crawled as his blue gaze raked over every curve and crevice of her face.
Oh, I certainly recognize her. She takes after her mother. Well done, you three. It is time we escort our beautiful guest to her new home.
Meiling cried out. She hit the ground hard, barely catching herself on her stinging palms. The ground was moist. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her hands on her dirty robes as the cell door banged shut. Blackness swallowed her, blocking out all sight. She groped and found slick, freezing iron bars. Why? Did they worry I was lonely? A feminine voice chirped nearby. Meiling gasped, jerking away from the iron bars. She backed up until she thumped hard into a cold stone wall. Something smooshed under her feet. It stank. Meiling almost vomited. How sweet of them to bring me a friend, the voice continued. Let me guess. Not a handsome prince to rescue me? Probably not a sage, either. No, they wouldn't want me having access to sagely wisdom. Not that I would have any use for such a thing. I tend to prefer stupidity. It works just as well half the time and is vastly more fun. Meiling blinked. She knew that voice. Not a prince, not a sage. That leaves only one option. You must be Princess Meiling. I do hope you brought a knife of some sort with you. Fei Yan, Meiling whispered, braving the blackness and stepping toward the voice. A laugh barked from the other cell. In one guess, I'm impressed. Unless you cheated, of course. I have no tolerance for cheaters. Usually. This did not bode well for Meiling's situation. Fei Yan could not have been here very long, and she was already clearly going insane. You were in Xu Zhen's mind. The illusionist's mind, Meiling blurted. There was a tiny pause. I should like to think so, Fei Yan said. He must have concussed me once or twice with those punches of his. Not exactly gentlemanlike. But I bit off his earlobe, so I suppose we're even. Sort of. What? Then she shook herself, shoving away the confusion. You were a shadow. I was trying to find his memories, and you guided me to them. Oh, really? How resourceful of me. Meiling licked her lips and tasted blood. Look, Princess, I've been hatching a plan. Fei Yan's voice got closer. Here, stretch out your hand. I'll heal you. After a moment of groping, Meiling's hand grasped Fei Yan's. It was warm, so alive. She was so reassured by that touch that she almost didn't realize the relief from the burning on her face and the stinging of her wrists. The ache spreading like a plague through her limbs washed away into nothing. Even the shallow cut in her chest and the bruise she'd had on her forehead, when she pressed on it, were completely healed. Meiling gasped. Thank you. Pfft, anytime. It is my utter delight. Silence fell. Back to business. Where would we be without business? Look, I've been plotting. I'm going to get out of here. You want to escape with me? Meiling's mouth twisted into the first smile in weeks. The first smile since she and Shang had ridden on the rise overlooking the valley and their fortress destination. The first smile since Shang had been smiling at her. I would love to escape with you. This has been Princess of Shadows and Starlight by Anastasis Blythe, narrated by Talon David. Copyright 2023 by Anastasis Blythe. Production copyright by Anastasis Blythe.